Hi, I'm Jay Martin with Bionics. I'd like to introduce you to the new socketless socket CX hybrid design. In the continued evolution of our socketless socket technology, this new configuration option is amazing. It is by far the simplest and most efficient socket design yet to be able to fit for AK level sockets. Just like the full CX design, has the same conforming brim, exact same brim comfort, adjustability, open structure, breathable, cool, but from the efficiency of fitting this, it has just taken it to a whole new level. So I fit this is the check socket version, the fitting process. We fit this morning from casting to fabrication and final fitting, ready for transfer within an hour and a half. So the level of efficiency, this is by far the fastest and most efficient AK socket design yet. What I love about this design though, is not just that it is really a great shift in how we can fit AK sockets here, but this is an amazing technology solution for developing nations where there's 30 million amputees who just don't have access to prosthetics. Now with this design, a layman anywhere in the world can successfully fit a long-lasting, comfortable AK socket in an hour and a half with simple hand tools. We used a couple of Allen wrenches, a hand drill, and some fiberglass wrap. And of course our socketless socket components, which all just like an erector set assembled together. Very, very simple, very efficient, and this will change the game of how we build AK sockets. The Configuration X, the CX design, is an amazing technology. You've used that design for almost a year now. Very comfortable, very conforming. What I love about the CX hybrid design is while the CX socket is, I think, a great design for most users, maybe not quite all users, but with the CX hybrid design, I don't know who isn't a candidate for it. It is just a much simpler system to fit from a practitioner perspective. It's going to be the most efficient path to the fitting. And from an end user perspective, the comfort level is exactly the same as the Configuration X socket. One of the questions I like to ask is, as a practitioner, which of my patients would I purposely prescribe a rigid brim for, right? And so now that we have the socketless socket technology and the conforming dynamic brim shape, I'd argue I don't know which patient would actually do better in a rigid, hard, static brim versus having a brim that conforms and fits much like a hammock. With this technique, the fitting process is just so fast and simple. As a practitioner, it wouldn't make sense time-wise, efficiency-wise, to go back to conventional fitting methods. So let's go and get started on the fitting. We're going to make a cast of the distal half of the limb, and that cast is going to become functionally equivalent to our first check socket. So we don't need to modify and plaster, we don't need to iterate through check sockets. We're literally making our cast into our socket shape. So we're doing the full fitting in real time in a single appointment. So here we go. I'm going to start with putting a barrier over the patient's liner. Now we can use any liner we want. We're using Ottobock Skio 6Y85 liner. Some of my favorite liners to use, just a really good liner. You can also use seal-in liners if you want to do suction or vacuum. Here we can incorporate pin or lanyard into the system. Any form of suspension works well. I'm just going to hold that in place. We could do this casting in sitting or in standing on this first section because we're literally just casting the distal half of the limb. Now when I take these casts, I take the length of the limb from the groin level to the distal end, bisect that in half, and I'm just going to cast that bottom half. I like to use the 3M soft cast material for this first cast. The dynamics of this material are very similar to a ProFlex inner socket. And so this initial cast will be the functional equivalent of a ProFlex inner socket as a check socket phase. All right. Now we don't need to cast the proximal half or the brim of the socket because, well, we're not going to have a proximal half or a brim of the socket. With the CX hybrid design, the proximal half of the socket is effectively just the socketless socket components. Just want this to be as even and symmetrical as possible. Nice smooth cast. Okay, so I've added my pin onto the end of the liner, and we've got our cast still on. If we're going to incorporate a pin lock, I'm going to add the pin lock over this initial check socket, Get that popped into place here. Okay. Now, you can use any form of suspension, a sealed inliner. This can become ultimately a Proflex, a sealed Proflex, or pin lock or lanyard, or whatever that may be. If you want to incorporate a pin lock, whichever lock you want to use, go ahead and put the lock on in this stage, and we're going to wrap the lock in and bond that to our flexible inner socket. I'm going to put a little piece of foam with some tape on it over the push button so we don't get plaster in that. There we go. Now, we want to make sure that the end of our liner is as smooth as possible. I have a little bit of a wrinkle here. We'll take care of that in the next, when we take this off after the casting. But let's go ahead and take another cast over this to incorporate it in. Again, I'm using the 3M soft cast material. You don't have to use this, but it makes for a little bit nicer transition at the proximal edge. So when we do the next step, we'll make the frame section a little bit lower, so we have a little bit of a flexible inner socket transition point at the top edge. That's why I like to use the 3M soft cast. Make this as nice, smooth proximal end, so we won't even really have to trim this off at all. Just come right to that same proximal end. Going to wrap this in. And we can do this full casting process in sitting or in standing. When we go to the next step, I prefer to do it in standing, but if a patient just is not able to stand for that long enough to take a cast, you could do this all in sitting as well. Now that this cast is complete, this is our flexible inner socket. This 3M soft cast material has some just nice rubbery feel to it, so like a Proflex inner socket. I'm going to put another barrier here so that the flexible inner does not stick to the outer frame, which we'll cast for next. Let's tape this in place. There we go. All right. So this next step is I'm going to add in our 2 lateral struts. So these are aluminum struts. We've cut these to length. I wanted to have these so that the proximal end of the posterior lateral strut sits just posterior to the trochanter and proximal maybe an inch, and then running straight down the length of the limb. We want this to come pretty close to the end of the limb length. With this long of a limb, we can cheat up a little bit, but in general, we want this to come as long as possible. And then the anterior medial strut is going to sit at about, if you cut the limb length or front to back dimensions, kind of that measurement, we want this to sit about 2/3 the width of the limb. So about that far apart looks pretty good. It's both almost parallel together, maybe a slight V shape. Then we can bend these struts to shape for the limb. I think this actually looks pretty good. Once these are really kind of form-fit and compressed into the limb tissue, that contouring actually looks pretty good. So I'm going to just tape these in place. These become the anchor points for the CX hybrid components. So just posterior to the trochanter, proximal about an inch, down the length of the limb, right about there. The swing brim will suspend from these struts. So think of this like the palm trees that the hammock is going to suspend from. And if you can imagine the lateral wall of a conventional socket, this is creating that lateral wall. Right. Let's go ahead and take a cast. Capture the shape and contouring of where those sit. Again, I'm just going to cast about 1 inch below our flexible inner socket so that we have the nice transition point more proximally. And if we cast this real well, we won't even have to do any trim work. So we're just going to let this set off, and then we'll take this back to the lab, strengthen this up, add our components, a little plate underneath to attach the knee onto, and then we'll be ready to attach all of the hybrid components onto it. So I'm smoothing in As I'm smoothing in the fiberglass wrap, I'm also just slightly holding the struts against the limb so they sit as contoured to the limb as possible. So a little bit of pressure, make sure that stays contoured right, nice to the limb shape. All right, so now that we have the cast taken, we have our frame, the blue section, our flexible inner socket, the white section, and we have our 2 lateral struts anchored in place. We're going to beef this up so it's ready to really walk on. So I'm first just going to gunk this in place, use some FabTech glue, find the right flexion and adduction angle, and then just gunk this in place. I'll wrap the gray plate in, and then this will be stout enough to go ahead and assemble the components and try on the patient. Now that we FabTech'd our initial cast in place, I'm going to go ahead and wrap in this into the gray plate. Make sure it's nice and strong, suitable for a patient to walk on. So if I take my cast really well, I won't even have to trim any of the sockets out, because these are my trim lines. I want to make sure the proximal end of our blue outer frame is strong enough, because we're going to be attaching some screws through to connect our lateral struts. Make sure they're nice and secure. So my next step here is I'm going to mark where the holes are, and I'm going to anchor some screws through those. So to measure this, I'm just going to slide one of my struts out, overlay it with the other strut so I know the holes line up, and then I can mark where these other holes are going to be. Those ones are marked. Should key back in place. Take my truss nut, put it through from the inside. Should go all the way through all the layers. Good, sandwiched in place. I'll do my next hole. Now that our 2 lateral anchor struts are affixed to the frame, we're going to open up our CX Hybrid, and this comes assembled. I'm going to place our 2 vertical struts, these 2 white struts right here. The anterior medial strut is going to sit right, the proximal end right over the adductor longus tendon running straight down. The posterior medial strut is going to sit, its proximal end, right under the tuberosity and come straight down. Now, while we're not rigidly supporting the tuberosity, positionally that's where we want them in space. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the bottom cross connector and get these lined up right where I want them. I know that on Tom, our length is going to be right at the full length. So I don't have to cut the struts, although if you need to cut them, simple just to cut them to length. I'm going to slide my air handling pedals down in between. These are going to be long, I'm going to need to cut them. But positionally, I want to find right where I want where I want them to sit. Now, if I spin this around on the posterior side, and all this isn't connected yet, but on the posterior side, the posterior lateral strut with the posterior medial strut should frame the hamstring muscle belly. It should sit due posterior. So I'm going to bring this in around a little bit more, so it would be more underneath the tuberosity level. So that kind of frames that hamstring muscle belly a little bit better. Swing it back around anterior perspective. Bring this one around a little bit further. That looks better to me. So all of these 4 struts should be pretty symmetrical around the limb. And medial, there's a medial perspective, posterior perspective. Again, we're framing that hamstring muscle belly due posterior. All right, that's about right where we want them. So I'm going to mark some holes to drill. Marking the positions to drill the holes. I'm going to go ahead and cut the air hammock pedals giving myself about 2 to 3 holes distal to the end of the strut. All right, now I can position this back here. I'm going to position the strut right over the top, height-wise, right over the top of the blue frame section. Line up with my hole. I'm going to mark where I drill. I'm going to drill at the same height of where my first full hole is, distal to where the frame sits. On this one again as well. I'm going to line up the position, put my white strut right over the top of the blue, height-wise, and then mark where that first full hole is in the air hammock pedal. All right, so now it's going to be right here and right here. Okay. I'm going to go and drill these out. Take my truss nuts, put them into the backside of the air hammock pedals. All right, now I'm going to slide my air hammock pedals in between my flexible inner socket and my frame. Just truss nuts to pop through. All right, pop my thumb screws back in place. Now for long limbs, you can have a second ratchet. For short limbs, you typically don't need it. I'm going to move this bottom band of cross connectors and the bottom ratchet. I like these to be kind of right in the bottom hole. It could be the second hole up as well. Either is fine, either here or here. I like to fit them here typically though. Oh, put my cross connector back in line. This as well. So having this cross connector distally, or at the very least putting a truss nut through this bottom hole connection, it just gives a little bit more solidification to the system. Takes out some of the flex of the struts and really solidifies it nicely. So line this up, hole number 7, that's where that fits into. Put a thumb screw in. All right, so we're assembled here. Medial panel looks good. I'm going to connect the posterior. So on the proximal end of the posterior medial strut, put my truss nut through, bring my webbing up, thumb screw back in. On the proximal posterior cross connector, this should go in the 4th hole down on the posterior lateral strut, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it should just pull snug. And we'll adjust the length of the webbing. That looks pretty good right about there. Okay, good, looks great. And then the proximal end of the anterior lateral strut is where we're going to house our ratchet. If you need to cut this air hammock pedal shorter, we certainly can. Got my truss nut, thumb screw. Come through proximal hole, always the proximal hole, and adjust this to length. I'm going to assume we're going to start off right about in that range. We can adjust the span on the patient if we need to. And last, I'm going to do one more cross connector proximally across the 2 lateral struts. I'll do this one in the 2nd hole down. And this one will just keep these 2 struts from wanting to yawn apart under weight bearing. Should be good right there. And again, this second ratchet is not always needed. Just for really long limbs, if you want some extra tissue containment on the distal anterior half, you certainly can use it. All right, and if we need to have something similar to this where we have the air hammock pedal underneath, we can incorporate that as well. Otherwise, we are fully assembled. Here is our CX hybrid socket ready to fit to the patient. So we've got the CX hybrid fit Now, Tom's wearing his original CX socket on the left side, the new CX hybrid we just made on his right side. Now, the three things I'm looking for is really just the position of the two lateral struts. The anterior lateral strut should sit kind of about where the front edge of the lateral wall trim line would round out to. The posterior lateral strut sits just posterior to the trochanter, proximal an inch, and then running straight down the limb. That looks good. They're well contoured to the limb shape. Can you face that way for me, Tom? The posterior side of this should frame the muscle belly, the hamstring muscle belly. So the posterior medial strut is sitting right under the tuberosity, running straight down the limb shape, making the hamstrings look due posterior. Now, we want to make sure that our proximal webbing is nice and snug. This looks pretty good. Maybe it could come on just a little bit tighter. All of the cross connectors are snug in the right positions. If we need to adjust something, it's a thumb screw, take it off, slide it where we need to. Now, this actually looks great out of the box right as we set it up. I don't really think we need to make any adjustments here anywhere on the socket. I think it looks fantastic. So as long as the cross connectors are all tight, the proximal webbing is snug, and the two lateral struts are sitting right where they need to go, that's really most of the fitting process. So we casted this. We know this part fits intimately well. Yep, you can face back this way. And so we'll incorporate the pin lock and do some dynamic alignment next. But from the fitting process for the CX Hybrid, that's as fast as that. So we probably spent maybe an hour and a half in casting and setting up the CX Hybrid onto the cast section, gunking it onto the components and getting everything set up. And then our fitting process on average takes minutes. So our adjustability parts to the fit are just changing a couple cross connectors to the right length, pulling the webbing tight, and you're done. So and here we really didn't have to adjust anything at all. That's often how the fittings of these go. So the fitting part itself, what we're doing right now on, is predominantly focused on just aligning the socket as you normally would. But the fit itself should be pretty fast and easy. All right, well that's it. Tom, what do you think? How's it feel?
It's amazing. Once again, it's a comfortable, firm, secure fit. The distal end of my limb in that socket is very, very comfortable.
Good. Now, how's the proximal end feel compared to your CX socket that you've been wearing for about a year?
Right now I'm not discerning a difference. This is the beauty of it. The comfort that I experience is right there.
Feels the same.
We didn't lose a thing.
Okay, good. And so having used the CX socket for about a year now, with this design, it's just as open, just as breathable, just as conforming, almost just as adjustable. Do you have a preference? Are they both just kind of on par with each other?
Right now, I'd say they're on par. Let me get a couple of 5Ks under me and to compare it.
Yep.
But in terms of just to stand up and be here, the coin's in the air. It's a toss-up.
Well, great. Well, thanks for letting us work with you today.
Thank you very much.
All right. This is the new CX Hybrid in its definitive form. So we've taken our initial check socket, our cast version, we've put in the transfer jig, transferred it out to the final stage. There's two paths we can take. One is we can leave the aluminum struts from our check socket stage in the definitive socket, simply making a really short lamination piece that is just the bottom few inches. We have kind of 4 legs to that, to where we're attaching our medial panel onto 2 of them and our lateral struts onto the other 2. So this is a really simple way of doing the final fabrication. The whole socketless socket cage just lifts off the check socket and bolts right on, or attaches right on to the laminated version. Alternatively, we can replace our aluminum struts with a long loop lamination. So this is very similar to the original CX design, very low profile, really pretty simple transfer process. Just a matter of your preference from a cosmetic standpoint, or whichever fabrication approach fits your clinic better. But both of these sockets are equally as comfortable as the full CX design in the brim and the medial panel. The conformity to the body is super dynamic. In fact, I'd probably say that the CX Hybrid design has probably a little bit more conformity, more volume accommodation than the CX design, even because of the way we're wrapping around the whole limb versus the opposing struts. You get a lot of adjustability here as you tighten up the anterior ratchets. Now, the one other thing that we've done different on this between these two is I've added this second ratchet distally. So this would be used for if you have a patient with a lot of extra tissue, the tissue is kind of spilling out in this area. You can just simply add a second ratchet distally. You can put an air hammock pedal behind it if you need, and this can just really help to contain that tissue a little bit more effectively. We could do the same over here. It's a modular piece, easy to put on. So the new CX Hybrid fitting and fabrication approach is by far the simplest, most efficient, most effective way of fitting the socketless socket yet. In our clinic, I'm actually fitting more CX hybrids now than I am the CX design. I just love this approach. It's just so simple to fit, and the comfort level for users that we've taken out of the CX design and fit them into the new hybrid, they can't tell the difference in the fit, in the comfort. They feel exactly the same, but fitting these is just so much simpler and faster to that end goal. So this could be a really great path for integrating into clinical practice. Anything we can do to continue to help in transferring our knowledge base and fitting these, happy to do so. You can of course find all of our training at socket-soft.com, and look forward to working with you on your next CX Hybrid.